Hi, I'm Dr. Sanjay Rao, and thank you for joining me today evening on our talk on anxiety, worry, and uncertainty, taking action through understanding. And very obviously, we are referring to our current situation. There's already anxiety and uncertainty in society at any given time, but in the current time, we are facing a very, very unprecedented level of anxiety and worry, and therefore this talk. This is our second talk, and I really thank my colleagues at Snap Clarity who have done an excellent backup with IT. And I hope that you like this talk, find it useful, and do get back to us with comments as to what you would like to see more and what we can do better. So, without much further ado, let's start the talk. Uh, so, this is us. We belong to the CMAP Health and Unified CBD Academy. CMAP Health provides clinical care to clients, and Unified CBD Academy trains therapists, and it's probably one of the widest in terms of offerings in North America and informed very much by international standards in psychological treatments. I am a consultant psychiatrist. I have a routine frontline public service job, and I'm also an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Ottawa and also affiliated with the University of Dalhousie. And I'll be joined by our lovely host, Bonnie Kuehl, who will be taking questions and moderating our discussion today. So we hope to share with you not just ideas about treating anxiety and depression, but also what we're seeing as global patterns of mental health at the present time. I'll also look at insight from literature and global literature over decades to see what we can learn from our experiences. And we hope that at the end of it, what you will hear will be useful to you from today and tomorrow. And we obviously want to hear what you have to say to help us do our presentations better. So I'll start with a personal reflection. This is about late 90s, and I was moving from one continent to another. I was moving from India to Europe to UK. And at that time, as it happens, when you change places, things change a lot. Um, and the first thing I noticed that I had to buy many insurances. I had to buy health insurance and life insurance, um, home insurance, professional insurance. And when you went to buy a printer, they made you buy insurance as well to insure their printer. This was very alien to me, and I don't know whether my parents are listening today, but they probably will agree that we had never heard of so many insurances where I grew up. I think I may have heard of life insurance, and I never even asked them whether they had life insurance. So here I am, moving from a country where likelihood of things going wrong was higher overall in day-to-day life, and moving to a much safer and economically advanced environment and having to buy more insurance. And that sort of thing sat with me for a long period of time. And I'm going to probably try to answer some of those questions in the presentation. And the answers are quite surprising, even to me. So, has anxiety become worse? I mean, every stress management guru tries to convince us how the society is becoming more stressed. So let's look at this data. And there's data going behind, even beyond this, which I haven't pulled together today. But as we can see, there has been no increase in anxiety over the past few decades in terms of the percentage of people who are anxious. Sure, there is an increase in anxiety because there's an increase in population, so there's more unwellness, as you can imagine, in terms of absolute numbers, but in terms of percentages, there has been no increase in anxiety. Yes, there has been increase in psychological distress, how people score themselves when you ask them whether they're distressed. There's other data to show that life was much harder at the turn of 20th century, when majority of the world was living in poverty. So really, things have been getting better for us overall. Let's look at happiness over these 2 decades. And I could have added data of more countries, but if you look at it, if at all, happiness has been slightly better over time. Many countries who were scoring high on happiness, for instance, Canada, Sweden, not much change over the last 20, 30 years. Some countries like Russia or USSR, whichever way you want to look at it, has an increase in well-being, and it clearly shows that change in government can dramatically affect well-being, and only slight dips in well-being in other countries. So anxiety hasn't changed dramatically over time, and happiness hasn't changed dramatically over time. So that's an interesting piece of data. And what we also notice is that if we take life satisfaction as a proxy for happiness, it's certainly related to the income of a country. We're not talking about income of an individual, but income of a country. And if we were to draw a straight line from here, if you can see my cursor going up, that's the straight line which shows the correlation between income and life satisfaction. Now, certain countries have more life satisfaction than can be expected out of the incomes. For instance, Costa Rica is a clear outlier. People are much happier there for the income they have. And then there are other countries below this invisible straight line are lower in their happiness for what should be with their income. Certain countries like Canada, etc., they always have been on top of the happiness charts for a long period of time. But certainly there's correlation between income and happiness. However, the correlation is not so clear when within the country, if you look at increase in income and increase in life satisfaction. And there are various reasons why this happens. And one of the explanations could be it depends on how the government decides to spend the money through increased income in the country. So if, for instance, the overall income of Canadians double, they will not become dramatically more happy by those predictions. But in general, there is a correlation between happiness and income. And here's the surprising data. There's a correlation between worrying and income as well. The more income we have as countries, the higher the likelihood of worrying. So isn't that a paradox? The lower income countries where we're clearly seeing there's less happiness, there's also less worrying. And if you look at the mental health statistics, a lot of the 1 in 4 statistics in mental health that you see, so 1 in 4 of us have some form of mental health problem, uh, that is largely anxiety disorders. So we should really pay attention to anxiety disorders. I think we hear a lot about depression, and absolutely, we should do something about depression, which costs years of life. But we should also do something about anxiety, which is the most common mental health disorder in our communities. So, does better quality of life, meaning more income, more disposable income, etc., make us more frail? Why do we worry more when we have every reason to be more happy? And actually, the counterintuitive answer is no. In fact, when you look at the lifespan with a country's income, it actually increases. So, increasing income of a country improves physical and mental health, even though the anxiety is going up with income. And this is Dr. Rosling, who sadly has passed away, I believe from Sweden, using a software called Gapminder, showing the correlations. And he has done some seminal research to show what really matters to improve the quality of life of citizens of countries across the world. So in general, we can see that a country doing better economically is good for both physical and physical health and happiness. So how do we explain this conundrum that increasing income leads to both increase in happiness and worrying? Should we not be more content, more secure as our income increases? And that's the question which I faced. Why is it that we are buying so many insurances when life is actually getting safer, better, and more affordable? Uh, and one of the explanations, and if somebody has questions, we can talk more about this, is that perhaps anxiety and happiness are not opposite poles. Perhaps they're dimensions of human experience. So technically, we could be happy and anxious, and unhappy but not anxious. So that seems counterintuitive, but that's what data from physiology is showing. That's what we are seeing from world patterns. And there is some other powerful research to show that even if we have mental health adversities, we are capable of experiencing happiness, which can be somewhat, not completely, but somewhat independent of our adversity. So that's a real message of hope, that adversities don't necessarily have to cost our happiness. So let's start with thinking about anxiety. So anxiety can be so many things. So anxiety as a word, we in English language, we might say, I'm anxious about something, meaning that I'm concerned about something. Or it could be an emotion. So experiencing emotion, perhaps me giving this talk, I might be experiencing some anxiety, which may be influencing my thoughts. My heart rate probably has gone up, and I'm perhaps experiencing a little bit of fidgetiness as I'm giving this talk. So that's anxiety as an emotion. Now, anxiety as a disorder is quite a different range of things, and we should not equate one with the other. Otherwise, our mental health services would be inundated with people experiencing anxiety as an emotion. So, anxiety as a disorder are different types of anxiety. Social anxiety is when we fear negative evaluation from other people, and very unrealistically so. Generalized anxiety is when we worry excessively, and this happens over months, not over 1 or 2 weeks. Panic is when we have actual panic attacks and avoid situations where we can have panic attacks. Health and illness anxiety is typical of people who somehow are convinced that they might have an illness which could cost them their life or quality of life. And even though at times they know that this is irrational, their behaviors don't seem to belie that fact. And finally, obsessive compulsive disorder, people have heard a lot about this. There have been Hollywood movies about it. Repeated checking, repeated intrusive thoughts, and of course, post-traumatic stress disorder with wars and people's adversities and abuses, etc., that can happen. So these are the major category of anxiety disorders that we find in our clinical practice. There are more, of course, but these are the major ones. So let's look at anxiety. It is a common experience right from the time life evolved. So when we were, well, we as in the common inheritance from evolution, were single-celled organisms, anxiety was a form of defensiveness to move away from something which was dangerous or noxious or high temperature, which could kill the animal or the organism. So moving away response as protection was very common feature of single-celled organism and still is. Fear responses in laboratory either leads to escaping the feared object or freezing when escape is not possible. And this is typically seen in laboratory rats and mice and is used as a way to study human anxiety as well. And as we evolved, we can see anxiety is kind of locating, not exactly, but roughly locating to a structure called amygdala, which is in the deeper part of our brain, which is kind of the more ancient brain. Some people have heard the term lizard brain. So somehow, some of our intense anxiety and even anger reactions can be traced to this part of the brain. Now, here's the interesting fact. The anxiety may sit in that part of the brain, but if you want to unlearn the anxiety, learn to deal with your anxieties, then you need to use your thinking, because that unlearning happens in the thinking part of the brain. And I've just shown that with an arrow, which is your prefrontal lobes, where a lot of thinking happens. Now, there is something equivalent to that in animals as well, but in humans, a lot of the unlearning of anxiety happens in this area, the prefrontal cortex. Now, what is the difference between anxiety, fear, and worrying? Animals don't worry. Animals have fear. Humans worry because worrying is a form of thinking. Worrying requires language. In fact, some researchers would say that we worry because we have a language. So you can see the brain evolution, the brain of an amphibian and then brain of a reptile, uh, as it as it evolves. You see the increase in size of the brain, and in particular, the front part of the brain which increases as evolution happens. And that's where is the seat of our thinking activity. So we can say that worrying is not strictly an emotion, it's thinking. And fear and anxiety are emotions which have very prominent physiological responses. And there is the matter of stress. And I just want to touch on this lightly because very wrongly over decades, people have argued in various stress management workshops that stress is about fight and flight. It doesn't really make sense. People get stressed when they lose people in their life, when they lose their jobs. So losses can also cause stress, not just threats. So fight and flight is not a good example of stress. It's not a good model for stress. So stress is actually a different physiological system. It's a whole body response which involves our the neurocircuitry which is involved with our hormonal mechanisms, and that's probably another talk in itself to talk about how to think about stress. Now, stress can happen when we have prolonged bouts of mental health problems. And why typically one of the stress illnesses is actually depression. So is anxiety bad? We've seen that there is an element of protectiveness with anxiety, and this is really a seminal study. This study takes place in a UK where they followed up people born in about 40s, I think 4,000 people were followed up over their lifespan. And what you can see, the labeling of this slides are not so good. So I'm trying to show you with my arrowed labels that if you look at people who have high anxiety, the good part of it is that they die less of accidents. But if you look at people, so if you with high anxiety, they're more likely later to die of non-accidental deaths, which means death related to other health causes, compared to people who have low anxiety. So the high anxiety people are in the dotted lines, and the low anxiety people are in the continuous lines. And you can see this clearly that around the age of 25, up to the age of 25, having low anxiety is having high anxiety is likely protective because it prevents accidents. But after that, you can see that the graph goes up, and having high anxiety in your adult and older adult age is not a good thing. So let's look at anxiety and anxiety disorders across lifespan. We are really referring to anxiety disorders here. Uh, the good news is most of our anxieties actually come down over time. As you grow older, you mature, your anxieties actually come down, which is the good news. The one kind of anxiety which goes up is worrying. Even though I said worrying is actually thinking, what they're talking about is generalized anxiety disorder. That actually increases. And there are a number of hypotheses around this. If you look at the other anxiety, other fear which people have, which increases with time, is fear of falling. So with age comes insecurity and worrying. And over the period of adulthood and old age, these are the two kinds of anxieties which start going up. Now, I'm taking a lot of time to do an introduction about anxiety and anxiety disorders in this talk because I really want to start from strong foundations before we talk about how to deal with the anxiety and crisis and difficulties we're dealing with now. This is a paper which has been published last week, actually, I think 13th or 14th of this month, which is looking at a response to what should we be doing in pandemics. And one of the interesting facts is a pandemic, even if it's physical, is as much of a mental health crisis. In fact, the one piece of data I haven't included here or point is that it increases the risk of suicide and self-harm as well. So even though we're thinking of physical health problems, pandemics actually create equal or more numbers with mental health problems, and social isolation, loneliness, is significantly linked with these problems. And post-recovery from the pandemic, people may develop other kinds of anxiety like post-traumatic stress disorder. And here's the early data from China. I was curious, in those places where the pandemic has happened and there is a recovery slope, what's going on with anxiety? And can you believe it? There are 190 cities in China which were surveyed. And what it shows is the most important problems people face during this pandemic there is anxiety. And even after COVID-19 peaked over 4 weeks, the anxiety continued. And what can we see? What here in terms of what matters and what are the protective factors? One of the key protective factors is the health information that we get and the precautionary measures we take. So, uh, good health information, social distancing, etc., are really important. And what the government is advising us are really true. And that the data shows it's not only good for physical health, it's also good for mental health. So, let's look at data on social media use and anxiety. Every day when I work in my outpatient, including today, people tell me that they have the tendency to turn off the social media, and they are right because if you're using extensive amounts of social media around this time, the data from China shows that you're 1.7 times more likely, so that's over 70% more likely to have anxiety and 1.9 times more likely to have any mental health disorder. So here's my message to everyone: get your news from reliable sources, and to political leaders that twittering about COVID-19 as a way to communicate with public is not a great idea. So what are our clinical experiences? So that was data, and our day-to-day clinical experience, including today when I was on my full-time day job, what we're noticing is that people who experience social anxiety are feeling less pressure because they really don't have to socialize as much. It is the world they have lived in before the pandemic started. But I keep telling them to use this time to reflect and continue to work on the social anxiety because anxiety in general is not a thing for health, as we have seen before. Health anxiety is much worse. So people who worry about their health are definitely even more worried now. Uh, People who have panic disorder and don't like to leave the house to be in crowded places, they feel worse when they leave. Even though the crowds are less, the anxiety has not gone down. I think the fear of COVID has added to the panic. People who tend to worry are absolutely worrying more. And there are new anxieties in those clients who have actually made good recovery, but this uh, pandemic has knocked the wind out of that recovery. And we are working very hard to make sure that they're supported and that they don't fall back to their previous mental states. So the challenge I found every day is sitting in front of the screen, trying to hold the concentration to do the work, is that it's requires a lot of competence to do good therapy and good treatment. And now we have the additional challenge of doing it through internet, doing it through telescreens, etc. So we really want to take up this challenge, and thankfully, I'm finding that the responses are very positive if we keep our hopes up and are systematic in the way we do our treatments. So people are getting better, and I have data to show that people with proper treatment through telehealth are actually getting better. There was a period of 1 or 2 weeks just after the Ontario slowdown and shutdown when things were difficult, but people are beginning to recover, at least in the populations that we are treating. So let's look at the psychological understanding of anxiety. I touched on the biology of anxiety. Fear of uncertainty is one of the big factor driving anxiety. And a lot of the research has come from Canada. Canada actually has been the world leader on fear of uncertainty studies. Hypervigilance, so looking at threatening information around us and selectively paying attention to it, is hypervigilance. Again, a common factor across many anxiety disorders. And we do become hypervigilant when we are faced with uncertainty. High risk estimation, so overestimating the dangers, is another issue which is seen across anxiety disorders. And we tend to check excessively. I mean, and we are asked to check excessively now. We are asked to wash our hands and check that we haven't got contaminated. So this is a very strange period where even normally we were, even in normal circumstances now, we are doing excessive checking, safety seeking, and avoidance. So here's a very interesting data, and even though I can't see the audience, this is an exercise worthwhile doing. And I'd like you to sort of just bear with me as I indulge you in this exercise. I'd like you to imagine that you were in a dentist chair and you were just facing the dental drill. And I want you to close your eyes perhaps like this and just imagine that for a few seconds. And I suspect you'll start feeling uncomfortable as you experience the image of the dental drill, I suspect. Uh, Now, what I would like you to do is open your eyes and imagine that you were talking to a friend about going to the dentist. And maybe you were saying that it was uncomfortable, but you managed it. So, whatever, you're having a conversation about it. And just think, which experience was more painful? Closing your eyes and imagining being in a dentist chair with a drill versus talking about it. Uh, and because I have no one to give me the response, I'm going to sort of give the response myself. Imagining the fear is much worse than talking about it. So, one of the theories is that we worry because it cuts down imagining fears by turning it into talk. So talk reduces anxiety in some ways. So why not worry if worry is such a good thing? Because it's cutting down the painful emotion. And this is just a graph to show you that imagery or imagining things is associated with more emotion as compared to a verbal activity or talking. So this is a very interesting theory. It shows that when we worry, we cut off the peak of anxiety by thinking about. So thinking is same as talking. Thinking and talking are similar and parallel activities. We talk because we think, or at least I hope most people do that. So if we worry and think or do mental talk, it cuts off the peak of anxiety. But what it does do in exchange is it prolongs the anxiety. So you're cutting off the peak, but the anxiety is lasting over a longer period of time. So there's a little bit of a trade-off. It doesn't hit you, but it prolongs the anxiety. And if you talk to people who worry, in some ways, worry is a way to not be taken by surprise if something bad happens. So I worry because I know that if something hits me, I can deal with it. But worrying doesn't always solve problems. So worry does solve problems, and that's why we worry. For instance, if we worry about the climate, we're going to do something about it. If we worry about our physical health, we're going to do things like social distancing. So worry does solve problems, but not when it becomes excessive, and not when we start using worry as a defense against anything we are uncertain about. So here's an illustration for those people who like reading philosophy. I've taken this visual from the myth of Sisyphus, where Sisyphus is a mythical hero of some sort who rolls up a heavy stone up the mountain and the stone rolls back. So worrying is the effort to roll up that stone of uncertainty over the mountain, and eventually the stone rolls back and you start worrying again to push it up the mountain. So that's the kind of the burden people live with when they worry excessively. So I'm moving now to what can we do about this? And this by no way is replacement for actual therapy. And my disclaimer is this is not your treatment. If you're having worry or anxiety, you should see a healthcare provider who's competent to provide you with some treatment. But some of these things may be helpful to most people in their day-to-day life in the climate we are in with the global pandemic. So worry and anxiety in these times. In working as a clinician, I try to think practically, how do we deal with this? So I ask my clients, and I have a whiteboard which would stand behind me and I would draw two lines and say, okay, so there is the COVID related worry, and there are the other worries which are indirectly related to COVID. For instance, how do I get my shopping done? Or will there be supplies? And how do I manage my budget? And what's happening to my elderly parents, etc. So there are indirect consequences of COVID. And of course, for many people, there are other anxieties and worries as well. So they might have PTSD or obsessive compulsive disorder. So other things to worry about apart from these worries. But within the whole COVID arena, we have two kinds of worries directly related to the health issues and indirectly related to the changes that the COVID is causing in the society. So how do we tackle this? And I actually looked at um, presentations from various places to highlight to my patients or clients how to deal with this. And yes, the presentations had very good points on managing stress, anxiety, sleeping better, keeping routines. But one of the things which I couldn't find, which was about what is the actual risk? How do we understand the numbers of risk? And like one of my clients told me, every time I see political leaders, prime ministers, every day in the briefings, they announce how many people have died. So things are bad. Lots of people are dying. So they're looking at absolute numbers of deaths, which is very frightening to any person. So we can look at this in this way. So know your numbers well. Uh, the term RO or R naught refers to the transmission rate. So transmission rate for COVID is 1.5 to 3.5. I mean, this is the best. I mean, I'm not a virologist, but this is data is open source, available through many sites. So which means that one person with COVID-19 infection is likely to pass it on to 1.5 to 3.5%. So maybe two to three people, 2 to 4 people. If you had the common flu, one person with common flu would pass it on to about 1 to 2 people. So that's kind of your reference range of risks. And with the SARS epidemic, it was passing on to two. So these are the transmission rates are not hugely different. What makes a difference, though, is globally we are practicing physical distancing. So these numbers that you're seeing, 1.5 to 3.5 now, are going to be much lower. So we are probably coming more closer to the common flu range of risk of transmission. So with social distancing, that's decreasing. Of course, we don't have widespread testing yet everywhere, but places where they have done widespread testing, we're getting this data. So in general, the risk of transmission now with social distancing is not going to be hugely different from what we expect from other corona type infections. So that's kind of the bottom line to think about. And uh, going to the next slide, we look at, so yes, doctor, that's what you say, but what about the people who are dying? So yes, that's the absolute number, but what about the people who are not dying despite having COVID-19 infection? And if you look at it, the rate of death with COVID-19 infection, given that we haven't tested everyone who has COVID, is 2%. Uh, it's higher than flu, absolutely. But if you look at the SARS epidemic, and very recently, some people may or may not have heard about it, the Middle Eastern syndrome, respiratory syndrome, which was an absolute killer. 1/3 of people were dying, and that spread across many countries, and that was fairly recent. So yes, COVID has spread very fast. We don't have very good immunity to it, but the risk of dying is much lower than other COVID-like or coronavirus infections. So that's kind of the interesting fact which we don't know. And by the way, as I was checking these things, I think 2018, 2019, about in 1 year, about 140,000 people died of measles. But the facts are not in front of us, so it doesn't worry us. Whereas right now we are about 160,000 or so with COVID, but many, many more people have survived in terms of the numbers infected. So we have seen worse. This is not the worst coronavirus infection that we are seeing. I've tested these things out. So when I do these things, I want to know what's the actual effect on people who are actually worrying. And the people whom I showed this to in my clinical work, were incredibly thankful because they said nowhere in the news or in the discussions by politicians, etc., did they actually come across these numbers. And they felt that this was really helpful for them to contextualize the fear. It doesn't go away completely, and it shouldn't, but it at least helps us understand what we should do practically at the face of this level of risk. And practically, we should continue being good citizens with social distancing, because eventually, by doing that, we are flattening the curve. So, how does the curve get flattened? So, let me go back to 2 slides before. If we do social distancing, eventually the transmission rate of COVID is going to fall to less than one. So, one person is transmitting it to less than one person, which then takes us into this part of the slope where things are going down. Uh, and that's what we are doing because that's the most effective intervention at the moment. No drugs, no treatments have been more effective now than physical distancing. And that we knew from data from across different countries. So let's take realistic risks, go out and do the things which we need to do, but keep the distance and be responsible to each other. And think of those people who are at high risk. So that itself is part of cognitive behavior therapy, understanding risk and actually working with the clients together, looking at reasonable sites on the internet and finding out how risk actually works. Now, for many people, no risk is small. So if I'm standing in front of someone in the virus, in the not in the virus, in the supermarket, and the person is not looking very well, well, has he or she got the virus, and what if I get from him? Now think of the actual risk. But these are the typical catastrophization thinking traps which happen to all of us in these kind of situations. But being aware of them is already taking good action against them. Or you read something in the social media and that sounded frightening. Well, the simplest advice is don't get your news about health from social media. As you saw the data from China, people who were deriving their news from social media or you were using social media excessively were more likely to have mental health problems in this period. It's not that we should avoid social media. It's a great thing to connect with people, but getting your objective news from social media is not a good idea. So let's look at what we do to keep safe. So I feel anxious. Of course, my tendency would be to keep myself safe, and that's reasonable too. But if I kept trying to be cocooned, it would reduce my anxiety in the short term, but it does not reduce my fear beliefs. My fear beliefs go unchallenged and they continue to plague me. So that's kind of the basic understanding of anxiety within the cognitive behavioral tradition. There's much more to it, different kinds of anxieties like social anxiety, panic, health anxiety. These have slightly different ways of manifesting and for us understanding, but this is a very core concept that I'm demonstrating here. So what should we do? Well, focus on what matters. Let's start with that. In my last presentation, I talked about why meaning making is really important for us to take any action in life. And I talked about Dr. Viktor Frankl's experience when faced with death in concentration camp. He focused on what was important in his life then and for the future to come. So why are things important to you is a good question to ask. It's not that you have to get into philosophical debates with yourself every day, but know what is important. The second who is really you. So know yourself as a person with your strengths, weaknesses, and resources. All humans are frail, but we all come with an element of inventiveness and strengths, which we use every day in different occasions. So being more specific about it will give us hope. And what are the choices to make? And we're not talking about big choices like pensions or buying a house, but choices we have to make day to day to keep going in the midst of this crisis. And what are the practical steps we need to take after we've made those choices? And where, when I say where refers to the space we act in. And the space we act in is the community we live in. And increasingly, and to my great happiness, we are not thinking of communities as our narrow neighborhoods, but actually a whole interconnected world, and it took a pandemic for us to realize that and continue living. So there may be fears about contracting infection, but as you saw, that there is a cost to being very fearful and anxious. It actually affects your physical health as well. So let's take small steps to reduce the avoidance. So step out to do the things you need to do, step out to do your exercise, um, step out to make sure that your family's needs are met, but keep a safe distance. And from what I can see around, people are doing that as best as they can. So keeping a distance does not mean not connecting. So let's delve in more into worrying. And very coincidentally, I actually have a workshop this Friday on teaching therapists an approach to worrying, and I'm hoping some of my students are watching this because this is a good preview to that workshop. And for those people who are interested in this area, this is pretty much what we are teaching professionals as well. So worry is helpful, and there are two kinds of worrying: productive worrying and the unproductive worrying. So when I'm working with clients, I'm saying to them, you're not abnormal. Productive worrying is actually a good thing to do. It's just that you're on the other edge of the spectrum, and we need to just move into this part of the spectrum of productive worrying. We don't have to almost surgically remove worrying. We don't have to do deep breathing exercises to just stop worrying, because worrying is actually quite helpful in many situations. So start looking at what's productive worrying. So you'll see that productive worrying is really a way for survival. Human beings have been incredible at survival as a species and incredible at worrying. So clearly, worrying has given us some survival skills. So what is unproductive worrying? So unproductive worrying is actually topic-wise the same things as we worry about with productive worrying, but it's excessive and disproportionate. It's present throughout the day or most of the day. So it's very persistent. It keeps intruding into our minds. And instead of worrying about what is kind of the key priorities to worry about, one starts worrying about everything. And if you actually want to watch a humorous clip on YouTube, or perhaps read this book, it's called Mr. Worry, which I used to borrow from my daughter to read out to my students about the life of Mr. Worry, who's a character who just cannot stop worrying. And in fact, when he does stop worrying, he actually starts missing his worrying. So that's a very interesting story and very, very instructive about understanding worry. So how does the worry cycle get propagated? This is the Canadian research, and I have labeled it the what if monster. So if I have doubts about anything, I wonder, what if this goes wrong? And sometimes it does go wrong, and sometimes it doesn't. But if the what if becomes the monster, I start thinking things will go wrong, even if there is the smallest chance of it going wrong. And that is fueled by uncertainty. So my search for the exact possibility for everything is based on satisfying my uncertainty or becoming certain, which then prompts worrying. So the tool for dealing with uncertainty is worrying. And some worrying is okay, but when it becomes overwhelming, it starts firing off anxiety, which is an emotion. And at that point, we are unable to take action to solve problems. And sometimes we have a strange kind of fatigue which comes from overthinking. And this is very typical and classical when we talk to people who have been worrying for months and years. They completely identify with the fatigue which comes through excessive worrying. And it also leads to excessive avoidance of things. And those avoidance may not be visible avoidance, but even mental avoidance of things which people might worry about, because worry, instead of being a productive problem solving tool, becomes a monster which starts controlling people's lives. So first things first, how do we deal with worry? And here's the big tip. Let's start thinking of worrying as an action inside our head. And one of my really close colleagues from Nova Scotia, who's an excellent clinical psychologist called Tammy, she says, she tells her client, worry is the behavior of your mind. It's not just thinking. And that's true. At some point in time, the persistence and repetition of worrying becomes like an action. rather than a thought. And very often, many clients, and actually many books, even in cognitive behavior therapy, teach us to treat worrying as thoughts and start challenging it. The problem with challenging worrying is you're thinking even harder. So thinking is a problem, and now we challenge the thinking, and even more thinking is happening. So very often I tell my students, don't do that. Let people first become aware of the activity of worrying rather than challenging the worrying. That's a wiser way through it than trying to challenge every worry, because that eventually will lead to fatigue because there's so many things to worry about. So we can also start with putting the worry down on paper. Um, I think one of the time management gurus said, and his name escapes me, it'll come sometime, that the head is a terrible head office. So if you keep everything you worry about in your head, you can't solve it. So we ask people to keep the list of worry. Now, people who worry actually have very long lists, and they keep making those lists. Now, one single list, and from that list, we look at the things we can do something about and focus on that. And therefore, they are in larger letters here. And we start with those things in our list, which we can do something about, and then time frame it. So we are in the ideal time to practice these skills. We don't know when schools will open. We don't know when shops and stores will open. So we can't even think in terms of next 30 days or next 6 months. So let's start living in the next 7 days routines, because what can we do and what can we do in the next 7 days? Let's start there. That's our most important time frame to think about. When I've used these kind of techniques with people, they found it incredibly uh, relieving, because they can just narrow down to focus on what's important and what's important in the next few days. But people come back and say, I continue to worry because at some point in time, although the research hasn't gone there yet, but I predict it will, worrying is also a sort of habit. So uh, you just can't get rid of it, because the mind has become so oiled up to worry that it is an automatic response to situations that we face. So, in such cases, we want to help people understand that you're not your thoughts. And this is an interesting story, which I took my daughter's permission to tell you. And when she was 3, once I asked her, why do you think like this? And she laughed and said, I don't think, thoughts just happen. I don't think them. And that was really interesting, because that is a profound statement and a profound research question. I breathe, but I don't call myself a breather. But when I think, I call myself a thinker, as if thinking defines me. So if your worry defines you, then that becomes your life. But your thoughts are not all your life. So here's a kind of a visual which I sometimes show people, that these are your thoughts, but your life is more than your thoughts. So what do we do to practice life instead of practicing thinking? Because by worrying, you're really well practiced in thinking. And thinking is useful, but there's also the rest of life. So many people use mindfulness meditation techniques, which is basically a type of meditation where you're taught to pay attention to things wider than your thoughts, like your body sensations and things outside, etc. And um, we can use these kind of techniques. And the caution I tell people is these are not techniques to be just used lightly with everyone. These have to be refined to be used very specifically with people with mental health problems. So how to help them connect with phenomena larger than just their thinking. Uh, and it's satisfying. People feel more content and they feel less stressed when they start learning these techniques and applying this in life. And we have good research evidence for this. Another very popular term in psychotherapy literature is acceptance. And there would be another time where I could talk about meditation and acceptance, etc., and how to use in psychological treatments. So the most important thing I want to say about acceptance is a strategic thing. So acceptance is not about accepting how life is. Acceptance is about reducing the internal friction which comes with pushing our anxieties and pushing anything painful away. It's much better to make space for it and take actions which you can on your to-do list of worries. That is really the true meaning of acceptance. So acceptance is not of the situation. Acceptance is of the discomfort that the situation causes, but we can continue to do the right things to deal with the situation. So what else helps? Um, Exercise is a great way to deal with anxiety. In fact, there's independent research literature that when people start exercising, their anxiety goes down, because part of anxiety is fueled by sensitivity to body sensations, and exercises enhance body sensations. So people actually begin to tolerate their body sensations better. Apart from that, exercise also has a mood enhancing effect. Connection with people definitely reduces helplessness. So there was a very interesting presentation which I saw, and there's literature on this, which is expanding about interpersonal connections during the period of the 9/11 catastrophe in US. And the research showed that connection actually significantly reduced post-traumatic stress. And post-traumatic stress is often associated with helplessness. So just connecting with people, not no complicated therapy, just connecting with people can reduce helplessness. The third thing which I'm noticing in the current environment, and I will give you some stories about this, is downward comparisons. So seeing other people's plight. So downward comparisons is um, thinking about other people, perhaps in your neighborhood or in your community or across the world, who might be in a similar situation as you, but maybe worse off. And that somehow seems to bring in perspective and meaning. And we've seen this in other psychological treatments, but I'm seeing this more specifically in worry and anxiety in my own clients and patients. The one word of caution, there is something which I've also noticed is called joint catastrophizing, which is people getting together or talking together in a doom gloom way, fueling each other's worries even more. So I say to my students that when you are debating uh, and discussing about people's worries, there was one person who was thinking their worries, and now there are two people who are thinking their worries aloud. So, story from the front line. These are some real stories, and due to confidentiality, obviously, I'm going to sort of pull from a pool of experiences rather than individual person. Um, it's really heartening to see that people who are really struggling with their mental health issues, so many of them have told me uh, this, which was really profound, that we are going through all this and that's happening in the world, and maybe something good will come out of it. Maybe things people will learn to live and do things together. Now, can you imagine people who are themselves under such a lot of adversity, managing their livelihood or not managing it very well, can see a larger picture, which is really global. Uh, on other occasions, I've seen people who are absolutely homebound with their own fears, but would get out to help someone else because somebody in the neighborhood is old and frail and can't do their shopping or can't manage something else in their life. And it was very surprising because I wasn't really expecting that in the time that I've seen those people before. But they're coming up with some very, very striking ways of helping other people. People are also beginning to renew connections, and it's happening probably to all of us. And this is the great thing about social media, not so good for the news, but very good for connecting with people. And people are using this also as a stress strategy. So, coming to the end of my presentation, every day we should hit the reset button. And one way to do this is to have a relaxation routine towards the end of the day. And I've tried it myself, and it's incredibly helpful if we do it in a disciplined way. And reset to start the next day. And for those of you who are film buffs, you will recognize this movie with Tom Cruise, uh, where he is in a situation, who is an accidental soldier who goes to war, dies, and is taken back in time, lives the war again, and each time he relives, he dies and relives, he dies and relives. Each time he does that, almost getting resurrected each time, he learns how to deal with the complexities of the situation and eventually ends up beating the aliens who are trying to take over the earth. So I have taken a line from that movie: live, sleep, repeat. I think that's what I would like to leave as my advice to you today, because I try to live it too. Live, sleep, repeat, because folks, we are at the edge of tomorrow. Thank you. And my very last two slides is, if you are really, and this is thanks to my colleague, um, Bonnie, she said, but what do people do if they're struggling a lot? All this advice seems good, but what do they do? And that is a point where you might need a coach and therapist. If you're trying to do everything and it's not working out, think of somebody who can coach you through this. And my very, very, very final slide, because I have a little bit of angst about the debates about the role of World Health Organization. It's a great organization. It works with people across the world, irrespective of the country or status. So I think if you like this talk and you found anything helpful here, think about helping others and donate to the COVID-19 Solidarity Fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. Once again, you're incredibly insightful, vast knowledge that, that I get the joy of working with every day. So yeah, I get a whole lot more intelligent each and every day thanks to you. Couple of questions, and I want to touch base on the one that we talked about today, where, we're really good at starting off with, committing to what we want to commit to. So you tell us to, think about your thoughts, make them into tasks. Then you do it for a day, you get up the next day and you're kind of still struggling and you can't commit to what you did want to do yesterday. Can you speak a little bit about discipline and habit forming that leads to that, then the commitment of being able to do what you want to do every day?
Thank you, Bonnie. I mean, you have a habit of asking me questions which could lead to another talk, and hopefully one day we will. But that's very important. People are afraid of the word discipline because people in general think that they're not disciplined. I think so. I mean, I think about it that myself many times, because we think that we watch in the media and all through the Facebook, all these people who are incredibly disciplined, have great bodies, are just eating the right things, and so on and so forth. So I think, first of all, those kind of upward comparisons of discipline should be completely discarded. There's actually no evidence to that. I think we are all equally bad at keeping commitments. Meaning is just a way to get started, because if something is meaningful, you want to work towards it, that doesn't mean that you will consistently work towards it. And the discipline comes from motivation outside us, not from motivation inside. This is the other thing which people take wrong. They go to these great talks where, I don't know, walk over fire, get into a lot of motivated states, and think that everything is about their inner strengths. Inner strengths are important, but you live in an environment with other people. You need to find your motivation from outside you, as importantly. There's no super sportsman or musician who does without a manager or a trainer. They all need discipline. Even the high achievers need the motivation from outside. So my message here is, if you're struggling with motivation and you have good intent, look for motivation from outside. A routine is a motivation from outside. Another person to help you accountable is motivation from outside. And sometimes listening to a piece of good music is also motivation from outside.
Thank you. I know I'll try not to ask too many long-winded questions. Next one is, when we worry about what we might, you talked about uncertainty, how then it kind of fuels that worry. How do you, we can't uncertainty is things that we can't manage. So what is the, like, how do you approach uncertainty? It's an unknown that we can't really control.
It's a good point. I thought of including this in the slides, but they were getting too many. The first thing is that, we live with uncertainty every day. Uh, if you're waiting for a bus, you don't know whether it'll come exactly at that time. You don't know what you are going to eat on Thursday or Sunday. Maybe maybe some people eat the same thing on a Thursday, but there's so many things we don't know anyway. And we accept that level of uncertainty because even if things are uncertain, there is a rough outcome which we are headed to. So uncertainty is inevitable and we accept it every day. Uh, so how do you deal with uncertainty? How I work with this is teach people to see the ways they are responding to the uncertainty. So in day-to-day things which vex us, we take the uncertainty and roll with it. But the difference is with excessive worrying is how we deal with the uncertainty. And we deal with the uncertainty by trying to uh, worry excessively, like rolling up that stone up the hill. So we become the start of this work is to become aware of your uncertainty patterns. So I get people to keep diaries so they can track their worrying and uncertainty. Just becoming aware itself helps. So that's the first step. And then we start looking at practical ways of being productive warriors rather than unproductive warriors. And from there, we go on to practicing attentional skills, like we talked about mindfulness, to deal with the habitual pattern of worrying. Because even when you become a productive warrior, there's a background machinery of worrying going on. So that can only be worked out by teaching ourselves some experiential skills to focus our mind on more things than just our thoughts. So those are some things. I mean, I can't really roll out the whole therapy in that as an answer to the question, but those are my sort of key approaches that I use.
Think when people ask me, what I do, and you explain therapy, I think it's hard to gain perspective on what do you mean? I go and I see a therapist and you do this. So can you just push further a little bit on, a generalized anxiety CBT therapy would be how many sessions, and it's that practicing of skills and homework and tracking that we do, and we get really good at it week to week with a final outcome of feeling better. So can you just walk us through a journey of, somebody coming to see you for a generalized anxiety disorder?
So the journey is, it's about 10 to 12 sessions, generally speaking. And sometimes people might have generalized anxiety disorder. They may also have panic disorder. They may also have depression going on. Then we have to devise it to address all those different issues in a systematic way, as you've seen in some of my presentations. And that's kind of largely the group I deal with actually now. But in general, we start with giving the person good information about what this is. Very often when I speak to people, nobody's actually sat and explained to them what this is. They just treat it as some sort of suffering of life, which has arisen because of life circumstances. I try to be specific. What is the specific kind of problem that you're facing? How is it defined? And then I show them information about what are the things that we know from research and which are national or international guidelines, which are known to help people. So framing that initial introduction is very important. We don't need to jump into therapy. We need to give people time to think about the helpful information so that they feel encouraged when they're starting the journey. So feeling encouraged that what I'm going to take up has been shown to be effective and is being advised is my first important step. Then I help people understand that therapy is like learning new skills, and learning new skills requires a structure, some practice, someone to coach you, and eventually the skills belong to you. So therapy is not um, I don't know who it was, Woody Allen, who had like 10 years of therapy. That's not what we think as effective therapies. effective therapies are usually time limited because you learn the skills and you take it away. And how do you learn the skill? You practice in between sessions. And how do you track that you're getting better? Well, you have questionnaires and outcome measurements. And my most important tracking, which I may not have talked about as much before, is tracking to see, are they getting to what's important for them? So I want to get back to studying. I want to get back to working. Or I want to get back to doing that craft work, which I used to like doing with my family. All those things to me are very, very good outcome measures towards which we work as we're doing this work. And in 99% of the appointments that people come to us, we capture their data on anxiety and depression. And it's my firm belief, if you're not doing that, that's not good therapy, because just capturing the data session by session on people's anxiety and depression itself has been shown to be a very effective predictor of good response. So those are some of the things which we do, and our sessions are generally um, structured, have an agenda, it's organized so that people get all the time to focus on what's important for them.
Perfect. You captured exactly what I was hoping you would. And, when I try to frame it as far as people being proactive in their mental health, I often say to clients, when your eyesight, especially when you're over 40, that seems to be when it starts to kind of diminish, and you can't see and it gets a little bit blurry, you typically make an appointment to go get your eyes checked. You don't wait until you can't see 2 feet ahead of you. So it's to be proactive in your mental health. We spoke about tonight, typical anxiety and worry. And then it's to not let it get to a place where it becomes, too unhealthy or makes you too unwell. It's that balance of what is, an expected place of anxiety, and then where it leads to an unwellness that becomes, makes you functionally decline.
Yeah, so there's increasing amount of research how we can help people before they become unwell. And the majority of the research, when we look at balancing the cost of healthcare with outcomes, is based on early intervention. As in, not early intervention when you're 4 or 5 years of age, early intervention when you start showing first signs of struggling. And we can see that that has incredible economic benefit. In fact, if we provide cognitive behavioral therapy to people early on before they start developing full-blown anxiety and depression, and even when they have developed full-blown, we recoup that cost by keeping people productive. And we recoup the cost again in the second year because people's physical health seems to improve when they get cognitive behavior therapy. So we actually recoup the cost twice in providing good treatment. And you hit the nail on the head. Early intervention is very important. I'm not so sure about the eye deterioration example. Right now, a lot of the optometrists are closed, but mental health professionals are still working, so we can still help you.
Fair enough. So I think, you know what? I think we won't keep people much longer. I do want to thank Snap Clarity again for being such an incredibly generous partner in this collaboration. And I want everybody to know that we're here for you. So we're doing this because we're grateful that we have the expertise to help. So this conversation group is open. It's, we can respond daily. So please do not hesitate to reach out. Let us know what your thoughts are, what you might want some support with. We're here for you. So please, our knowledge is yours to access. So don't hesitate to reach out and let us know what you're interested in, what topics you'd like to see us speak on. We have a few ideas. We will be back next Tuesday, same time, same place. So stay tuned and we will keep you posted on what our next topic will be. So thank you for joining us. Yes,
Thank you for joining us.
Take care.